Aggregate demand and aggregate supply is another way whereby we're going to express the state of the U.S. economy. At first, let's distinguish between a micro view of demand and supply and a macro view, which will be aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So for starters, let's say that we're looking here at the micro picture because we're looking at only one item, let's say cars, the demand for cars. We have prices on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. How are we going to express the demand for the whole economy in a macro picture? The demand for all the goods and services produced. Well, that would be your aggregate demand. So while we had prices on that axis, the macro picture of prices of one item would be the price level. And the price level will therefore give you either inflation if prices go up or deflation if prices go down. Now, quantity refers to the quantity, the number of cars demanded. Well, here, when we're looking at aggregate demand, we're going to be looking at the demand for all the cars and all the other goods that have been produced, and that would be the GDP. Keep in mind that the GDP is going to be equal to incomes, and it will also go in the same direction as employment, which means if GDP goes up, then incomes generated are also going to go up and employment is going to be going up. In order to look at the shift of the aggregate demand curve, we're going to be looking at what actually happens to the components of aggregate demand. Remember, aggregate demand was made up of C plus I plus G plus net exports. If there is a change in any one of those, then your whole line is going to be moving either out if there is an increase or in if there is a decrease. So let's look at consumers. If consumers have higher incomes, they will be spending more, they will be demanding more. As a result, aggregate demand is going to be moving out. Another aspect is going to be the wealth that people have amassed. And the largest component of wealth for most American families is their home. We have seen a very sharp increase in the price of homes in the late 90s, even in the early, around 2004, 2005. In 2006, those prices started coming down. But let's see what happens when you are looking at an increase in the price of your home. You feel richer, and therefore you are going to be spending more. So if there is an increase in the value or in the price of what is the most important aspect of your asset, then you're going to have an increase in your aggregate demand. Expectations: if people are pessimistic about the future, they are going to be spending less, therefore aggregate demand is going to be moving in. Interest rates: if interest rates go up, then we can borrow at a higher price, and therefore we are going to be buying fewer large ticket items for which we're going to be borrowing money. The debt: if the amount of debt that consumers have increases, if more banks are eager to lend out money, then you will see an increase in aggregate demand. People are going to be buying not from their income, but from the fact that they can borrow money. And then, of course, taxes. If taxes go up, well, obviously you have less money, and therefore aggregate demand is going to be going in. So that would be for consumption. Now, how about investment? Well, for investment, remember, you're looking at businesses. And probably the most important reason why a business is going to spend more money on machinery and equipment and expanding their productive capacity would be because of a good climate, a good economic climate, hoping to make more profits. Higher profits will stimulate more people to go into business, and as a result, more money spent on machinery and equipment. Interest rates, well, that of course affects also, because if interest rates go up, then the money that you're going to be borrowing in order to make those purchases is going to be more expensive. You will be borrowing less, and therefore spending less. Aggregate demand is going to decrease. Subsidies and taxes. If the government gives subsidies to a particular industry, then you're going to see more money spent on investments. As a result, your aggregate demand is going to be increasing. Taxes would be doing just the opposite. So now how about government? The third element of aggregate demand. Government, it'll also depend on the state of the economy. If the economy is doing poorly, then the government is going to be spending more in welfare, in unemployment compensation, and as a result, your aggregate demand curve would be moving out. But since we're looking at international trade, we know that net exports are also another element that is a component of aggregate demand. And this is the way it works. Net exports is the difference between exports and imports. So if our exports go up, then your aggregate demand is going to be moving out. So what is going to increase your net exports? Well, it all depends on the value of the US dollar. If the US dollar falls in value, then as a result, our products become cheaper. And if they become cheaper, then exports are going to be going up. By the same token, if the value of the dollar has fallen, then foreign goods are more expensive, and as a result, there is going to be less imports. And vice versa, if the value of the dollar goes up, then our exports are going to go down and our imports are going to be going up. In that situation, your aggregate demand is going to be moving in. Incomes of people, of countries that we trade with is also a very important element, because as their incomes go up, then you are going to be able to sell more to them because they will be demanding more of our products. Therefore, net exports are going to be going up. This is why we're always interested in having other countries grow faster, not because we would like only them to be happier, but we would like to be able to sell them more goods and therefore increase our exports. The next question is, how about moving along your aggregate demand curve? Well, for that, we're going to be looking at the elements that make up the vertical line and the horizontal line of the graph for aggregate demand. So if there is a change in the price level, because that's one of the elements that is measured right here, you're going to be moving along the same line. And the same goes for a change in GDP. A change in GDP will move you along the same line. So the shift is because of components of aggregate demand changing, and you move along the line if either the price level changes or if the GDP changes. So now let's look at our aggregate supply. And aggregate supply will represent everything that we have produced. And we are going to distinguish between aggregate supply in the short run and aggregate supply in the long run. In the short run, your aggregate supply curve is going to be upward sloping, up. And in the long run, your aggregate supply is going to be a vertical line, because we will assume that in the long run, we will be at equilibrium full employment. So long run, your aggregate supply is going to be like this. So here you have price and GDP, and this is price level and GDP. So what is going to shift our whole line, our whole aggregate supply? Well, the components or determinants of aggregate supply are going to be the resources, the level of education and technology, and government policies. Let's start with resources. Well, if we have more labor, then that is going to increase the amount that we can produce. How can we have more labor? Well, the most obvious is through an increase in population. But our population growth is relatively slow. The other way that we could increase the amount of workers we have in our economy is through immigration. California is one of those states where immigration is constantly debated, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Definitely, our economy is highly dependent on immigrants. And then the third one would be through outsourcing. Outsourcing is when you are producing either goods and services in an economy outside of your own. So in a way, you are able to use their labor, which means that we have a higher production possibility. Now, beside resources, we also are looking at education. If people are better educated, if your workers are more skilled, then you are going to be able to produce more. Aggregate supply is going to be moving out. Technology is another element. The better the technology, the more we can produce with the available resources, aggregate supply would be going up. And then government policies. If government is trying to encourage more businesses to start, that is another way that we're going to have a higher aggregate supply for the economy, more goods and services produced in the economy. So how does the aggregate supply curve look? Well, for the purpose of our discussion here, you will see that it's got three different segments, two of which we have already discussed. So this would be the upward sloping, the short run, right here from here to here, and then the vertical, which would put you at full employment GDP. In other words, you cannot produce more than that, and therefore your aggregate supply is straight. Even though maybe we are demanding more, there is no way we can produce more because we are at full employment. And then you've got this horizontal part, which is also called Keynesian. And that part shows that you are very far away from full employment, and therefore you have a big potential to increase output without having the cost of inflation. So how are we going to use this aggregate supply? We will use that with the aggregate demand curve. So let's start with a situation where you are very far away from full employment. This is your aggregate demand 1, and we increase to aggregate demand 2. Let's say that taxes have gone up, people are buying more. What is the result? You've got more output, GDP is higher, prices still remain the same. So that's good. Now next, the closer we come to full employment, the more shortages we are going to develop. And here, if you have an increase in aggregate demand, let's say AD3 to AD4, what happens? Well, this is where you were, and this is where you're going to. So one equilibrium to the next equilibrium. What you have seen is that GDP went up, yes, but at the same time, you also had an increase in prices, inflation. Now, how about the situation right here, AD5 to AD6? Well, here it is a situation where an increase in aggregate demand will have only created inflation, but there will have been no change in GDP. Bad move. Actually, if you are at 86, the best thing would be to move the aggregate demand curve down, because in this way you will not lose any output. You will still be producing at full employment, but you will have reduced your price level. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is very closely related to your production possibility curve. It showed how much was being produced. Now, aggregate demand is also very similar to your aggregate expenditure, which would have been in the Keynesian economy, or the Keynesian approach to economics. We call that aggregate expenditure, which is the same thing as aggregate demand. It was the C plus I plus G plus net exports. The difference between aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure is that they measure different things. Here, we will have measured changes in prices, while in the Keynesian model, you are only looking at the impact of a change in GDP onto your, the change in demand change in consumption or change in investment, and what kind of an impact it has on the GDP. Here, we're going to be looking at where would you like to be? And where are we right now? At this point, where is our economy? Is it close to, is it at 82, 83, maybe 84, maybe 86? Think about that. We'll have a discussion about it. Thank you.